Hello, everybody. Welcome to Thursday. Feels like a Friday, but it's not. I'm David Murphy from SLR Consulting, and we are here today to run through the fourth workshop of the week, workshop series number 2, focused on the NVCOG region. As I've said in the past couple of days, if you're here from a different region representing the state, we're glad to have you. We're going to focus on the NVCOG region through part of this workshop, but we will have discussions that touch on the whole state, really, or other regions as well. The team present today, Victoria Vitri and I from SLR Consulting, will be presenters and breakout room facilitators. We don't have Noah Sloven from our firm today, so Victoria is additionally going to be the Zoom controller. So if you have a Zoom related technical question, send a message to Victoria and she'll try to help you with that. She will also be placing people into breakout rooms. So if you have a question about a breakout room, you can contact her and she'll help you. Scott Choquette and Johanna Greenspan Johnston from Dewberry, our consultant team members, are also on board. And then we've got, I believe, 4 people from Circa today. So John, Joanna, Yakrak, and Katie. I didn't see Jim's name on the list, but I guess he could join us. So we'll see, he may be in later on. Just run through the objectives for today. So we're going to review the methods that we use to identify potential opportunity areas. And in doing so, we'll talk about what is a potential adaptation and resilience opportunity area. Let's make sure we know what we're talking about, right? And then how do we link the vulnerability mapping for the zones of shared risk and regional assets and infrastructure to identify these areas? So we'll cover all that. We'll do a presentation of those areas and sort of talk about what is a general profile of areas in the region. How does it look? Did they kind of land where we expected? We'll do a breakout room for discussion about the specific areas and talk about if we missed anything, did we include enough infrastructure and assets to really find these? Do we have any thoughts about these areas? We'll do a quick report out, and then we will kind of end with a discussion of the next steps. This next slide is a time frame, and if you were with us, and I know a couple of you, Peter, for example, you're in this meeting, you were in the one yesterday and the day before. We've revised this slightly because we had a lot of attendees register from the state of Connecticut, state agencies for today's meeting. So we wanted to kind of approach things a little bit differently. So instead of having 4 main parts, we kind of have 5. So the review the methods, we'll do that for 25 minutes, presentation of the areas to everybody for about 20 minutes, and then we'll go into the breakout rooms for a shorter amount of time compared to yesterday. So instead of 45 minutes, we'll do a half an hour. And then the rest of it is the same, the report out for 10 minutes, then open discussion. So a little bit different, but we're covering really the same kind of material. As always, if you have any problems with a Zoom, a personal problem, log off, log back in, we'll let you back in. If there's a power failure or something and either Victoria or I is lost from the meeting, the other one will take over and keep going. So don't log out if one of us disappears. But if something goes wrong for all of us, please do be patient and then reconnect. So let's go through and review those methods that we use to identify the potential opportunity areas. And it's funny, I was saying to Victoria just 10 minutes ago, in all of these workshops, no one's ever said to us, oh, that's Norwalk in that picture right there. So this graphic, which we obtained from Circa probably a year ago when we got started, no one ever said, oh, that looks a lot like Norwalk Harbor. Well, it is. And you can kind of see I-95 and Amtrak line and other roads and arrows. And we'll talk about what that means as we go through the workshop today. And hopefully things that we talk about will make sense when you see this graphic again. So let's get oriented. So what is a potential regional adaptation resilience opportunity area? It's a lot of words. And we're going to touch on each one of them so that we have a clear understanding of what we're talking about today. So potential, that's a word that we all know, right? That's something that's been identified through some kind of analysis. In this case, an analysis of vulnerabilities and risks, but we don't know yet whether this thing that we're talking about is going to be making it to the end of the project, right? This is a planning process, and in a planning process, we typically have things that we talk about that have some potential. What does regional mean? Well, regional, we know what that means in Connecticut because we've done a lot of good work to kind of plan and do projects regionally, and we're getting better at it over time, which is great. So of significance to more than one community, or of significance to a council of government or to the state. Adaptation, This is a good, reasonable definition is changes over time to address the challenges caused by climate change. And it's important to note that in this project, adaptation is one of the 4 components of the next word, resilience, which is oftentimes known as the ability to prepare for, withstand, recover from a severe event, and then adapt going forward. So adaptation is a really important part of resilience. We know that there are other definitions of resilience out there, and those are great, but for today's purposes, we're using this definition. An opportunity is something that is positive that we can do where a challenge exists. In the context of this project, we're talking about climate-related challenges, specifically flooding and heat. So an opportunity is what we can do to kind of improve the conditions and reduce risk going forward. And then an area. So what do we mean by area? Well, it's more than a handful of parcels. It's perhaps part of the community, part of a town, or maybe a neighborhood, or maybe a couple neighborhoods, but it's certainly less than the size of the town in those cases. All right, continuing to kind of get our feet on the ground here, get oriented. So how did we get this far? Well, perhaps you've been part of these other workshops and meetings that have occurred. There's many familiar faces in the call, so you probably have seen a few of these. So the summit that occurred in November of 2020, so last fall, was a good chance for everyone from CIRCA and from the consultant team kind of describe the results of phase 1 of Resilient Connecticut, and then talk about the transition into phase 2, which is really what we're finishing up in the middle of 2021, phase 2, and we'll be moving into phase 3 soon. We've also been meeting with the COGs continuously, the COG boards themselves, but also the subcommittees, transportation and planning subcommittees that they have from fall 2020 through the present. I think the first meeting we had was in mid-October, if I remember correctly. And we've been providing monthly updates to the COGs. And as a result of doing that, we're also presenting to the chief elected officials. In January of this year, one of them was actually in February, we had a series of workshops to talk about the vulnerability assessment and the zones of shared risk. And during those workshops, we talked a lot about the vulnerability assessment tool that we developed, the CCVI, which is an acronym that you'll see coming up a little bit in this presentation. And we talked about the zones of shared risk as well. And because there was so much content, we came back again in a webinar in March of 2021 to give you an update on that assessment on the CCVI tool and talk about how we were addressing flooding and heat a little bit differently, but some commonalities in how we address the two of them. So again, a lot of discussions that we've had over the past 9 months or so, and hopefully we've seen you in some of those. Continuing to kind of get focused here, reminder of where we're working. So we're working in Fairfield and New Haven counties. That is where the funding from the federal government can be spent. And we've been looking at all 51 towns in those 2 counties for the vulnerability assessment and a lot of the planning work. But for today, we're kind of we're shifting the focus to those communities with TOD potential, so transit-oriented development. Those are the towns that are along rail lines. And some of them are not directly along rail lines. So for example, in the NVCOG region, Shelton doesn't come into contact with the Metro North spur to Waterbury, but downtown Derby station is within walking distance of Shelton. So it's one of those TOD towns. And we're talking about towns with that resilience corridor potential. So bolstering these corridors, connecting some of these hubs that can be made more resilient so that in the future people can move around before, during, and after disasters and other climate-induced events, heat events and flood events, for example. We haven't been starting from scratch. We worked with the COGs to collect a lot of data. This graphic on the right-hand side, those orange icons show you hazard mitigation plan projects. So these are actions that have been proposed in hazard mitigation plans. And we've kind of done a good job trying to map those out. But we've also been looking at plans of conservation and development and other planning documents that have to do with resilience or natural hazards. This is a graphic that we've seen a few times now. I think we first unveiled it in the fall of last year. So we talked a lot about how we've been working in these 3 buckets, the data analysis, identifying the challenges, then identifying opportunities. And so now what we're doing today is moving to this final column here, the opportunities area, opportunity areas that we've identified. There'll be a draft report issued in a few weeks, so watch for that. And that will the report will talk about the assessment, the zones of shared risk, and also how we selected and identified opportunity areas. So a series of terms I want to go through because we're going to use these terms today. And some of these you've seen before, but some may be new to you. So flood and heat vulnerabilities. So in the context of this project, it's really important to understand that vulnerability has three components. It's the exposure, the sensitivity, and then the adaptive capacity. So exposure, for example, under flooding means, are we in a flood zone? Can water come in contact with us during the flood? Whereas the sensitivity may be the building stock or the population who's there might have some sensitivities that are different because they're aged or have language barriers. And the flood adaptive capacity is, what can we do about flooding? Does the community have some sort of capacity to help people? Is the shelter nearby, or is there a lot of flood insurance in force? So those things together, blended together, give us an indication of flood vulnerability. In the CCVI tool that we've been talking about, Climate Change Vulnerability Index, is the place where you can kind of look at these scores. And a lot of you have done that in the past. And we appreciate that you've taken the time to look at the viewer, and we can give you links to that again if you need a fresh copy. The heat vulnerability, really a very similar term. These are the contributors to climate risk associated with heat instead of flooding, but the same three components, right? Exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And there's a viewer for this as well. The social vulnerabilities, so that's actually a component of the flood and heat vulnerabilities, but one of the things that we've done is taking kind of a broader look at social vulnerabilities and the factors that contribute to those, and we've mapped those out. The zones of shared risk, these are areas that face common challenges already or getting worse caused by climate change, and therefore risks are shared among different people that might have different perspectives and might have different priorities for how to respond and deal with that. And for this project, the zones of shared risk are primarily aligned with flood zones, but in a lot of places there is not a delineated flood zone. We'll look at one, in fact, in downtown Waterbury where there's not a flood zone that's been mapped. And there's also areas that can be isolated by flooding. So it's a higher area, but can be cut off. So there's kind of some good variation in the zones of shared risk that we'll see. Regional assets or infrastructure. So these are assets or infrastructure that serve more than one community. And we'll talk about that in a minute, what exactly we mean by that. Areas of planned development. So these are areas identified in POCDs or regional plans of conservation development that have, for a variety of development and redevelopment goals. We're not typically talking about wide areas of single family housing, right? We're not going to draw those. We're talking about different kinds of development and redevelopment here in this context. The federal opportunity zones, these have been identified by the federal government, and the state of Connecticut also recognizes them. You can jump onto the state OPM website and look at where these are. They're typically in urban areas, and they provide incentives for community investment. And then finally, TOD, right, transit-oriented development. These are the areas around the rail stations that are oftentimes, we want them to be pedestrian-friendly, mixed-use development that supports the transit. So those are the words. Let's look at some images. Here are some graphics, some screenshots from the flood and heat. Flood on the left, heat on the right, CCVI tool. The flood vulnerability tool, you can see the darker blues are primarily along rivers. And then on the right-hand side, the darker reds are the areas with the more heat vulnerability that are typically the urbanized areas. And that's usually the case. There are some areas that really kind of give some surprises. I think one thing about the heat mapping that I've noticed for the NVCOG region more than other regions is that you see a lot of the darker reds kind of stopping at the town boundaries. Well, development doesn't necessarily do that, right? So a good example is in Sonia Derby, where they touch, I think it is Oxford or Seymour, on the upper left of those towns. So on the right-hand graphic in the lower part of it, it's not like there's a house on one side and not on the other side, but there is a pattern there that has to do with social sensitivities, distances to shelters and cooling centers that can be very community specific. And that's why sometimes the vulnerability mapping seems to stop at town lines. And again, I only bring it up because we noticed it, I think, more in the NVCOG towns than in some of the other regions. Some of the social vulnerability mapping on the left-hand side. So these are organized by census tracts and blocks, which is why you see the funny polygon shapes. And then the darker colors represent the areas with higher social vulnerabilities. So typically it's socioeconomic, It could be access to different kinds of resources, and it could be lack of transportation, lack of a car, that sort of thing. It could be language barriers. It could be age classes, elderly or very young populations. On the right-hand side is an image of a zone of shared risk, something that we've seen before. If you were in the January workshops, you've seen this image. So the darker greens on this graphic represent flood zones, and then the lighter green is an area that can be cut off by flooding. So even though the people living inside that lighter green oval might not be exposed to the water, they are sort of stranded during a flood. So it's a different kind of a zone of shared risk, two different kinds depicted in this graphic. I told you a few minutes ago that we'd give you some examples of regional assets and infrastructure that were used to identify these opportunity areas. We've kind of placed them into three different buckets. On the left-hand side, you can see these are assets and infrastructure that serve many communities by virtue of spanning them, right? So a highway for the Amtrak line, CT Rail, Metro North. These are pieces of infrastructure that do touch many communities and serve them all at once, so they are regional. Also, some of the water systems and wastewater systems operate in the same kind of capacity, very linear systems that serve more than one community. Then in the middle bucket, we have kind of those regional assets that serve numerous communities, but really are doing it from one location. So a really good example is a hospital, right? So there's not a hospital in Prospect, so you have to drive to Waterbury Hospital, and it's a regional asset. And then on the right-hand side are regional economic assets. These are a little bit harder to identify. So major employers, major employment areas, large tourist sites, museums, historic districts. Historic districts is important. I've been saying this in every workshop, and I'm sure people who have been in every workshop are tired of hearing me say that in Connecticut, the State Historic Preservation Office is under DECD. So the state recognizes the economic value of historic structures. But Long Wharf, Steel Point, which are of course in New Haven and Bridgeport, and then retail shopping malls, things like that, those are all regional economic assets. A couple other graphics, I'm going to turn it over to Victoria. On the left-hand side is an area of a planned development area in Ansonia, and this is something that's been drawn based on a review of the Ansonia Plan of Conservation and Development. So this is a part of the town that the town anticipates redevelopment to occur. On the right-hand side, we've got an image on the upper right, Derby Transit-Oriented Development Area, and on the lower right, it's kind of our interpretation of those TOD areas. And what we've done is, with a dark gray crosshatch, identified the drive shed and the walk shed really within 3/4 of a mile from the train station. So of course, you can see that it extends outward along roads. And you'll notice, for example, that Bridge Street crosses over into Shelton, and that's a way that a person could access downtown Shelton from the downtown Derby rail station, and that's why Shelton is part of the TOD. Okay, I'm going to take a break, have some tea, so I can preserve my voice, and turn it over to Victoria.
Great, thanks, Dave. So let's take a walk through some of the overlay process here. So taking all of those different resources that Dave just reviewed into account, we'll take a look now to see how we put them together to identify these opportunity areas. So keep all of those resources in mind as we kind of step through this. There's a lot of numbers and figures, but we'll go through it slow here. So what we wanted to do out of all the data that we just discussed was use the zones of shared risk. So the ZSR is our foundation for identifying the opportunity areas, right? So these zones will hopefully identify, certain vulnerabilities and certain stakeholders sorry, UPS is knocking on my door. Certain vulnerabilities and then the stakeholders that we need to bring to the table for this conversation. So using that as the foundation, we had 656 of those. And then we took a look at which assets are in those zones of shared risk to identify them as kind of regional zones of shared risk, right? So all of those different assets, whether they span across municipalities or they're locational, serving the region, or if they're those economic assets, all of these green zones of shared risk that you see now have at least one of those in them. So they can technically be a regional zone of shared risk. So that narrowed our field down from 656 to 626. So still a pretty large number. So we wanted to try to zero in on these areas a little bit more. So the next step was taking a look at the number of assets within all of these regional zones of shared risk. So we identified the top 20% of the regional zones, and that gave us, I believe, 86, right? So everything you see here in the purple are those in that kind of top tier. They have the most number of assets throughout the region. So each of these purple regional zones of shared risk have between 6 and 16 assets. Those with the most numbers, I believe, between 12 to 16, there's really only 1 or 2 of those zones of shared risk. So the majority have between 6 and 10 assets. And again, that might be roadways, that might be railways, that might be those locationals or economics or historic resources, things like that. So taking that top 20%, we then wanted to take a look at, okay, where do they intersect some of those other planning efforts? Where do they intersect TOD areas? And where do they intersect some of the higher vulnerability areas? So working from all of those resources, we first took a look at which of these purple zones, which of these top tier regional zones of shared risk intersect the high flood and the high heat scenario. So the high flood and the high heat scenario is based on the CCVI results, the Climate Change Vulnerability Index results. So trying to find those pockets of vulnerability, we then took a look at, okay, where are these regional zones with the high flood, high heat, and where do they intersect with TOD areas? And then we also took a look at where they intersect with the planned development areas. So you could see on this map here, it's a little small, but we've got those small hashed areas, which are the TOD, and then we do have the planned development areas in the red. So, at first glance, we could see we have a few planned development areas. We even have a few zones or TODs, that right off the bat aren't intersecting perfectly. And then, you could see some clusters where they are all kind of intersecting a little bit better. So another note that I've been pointing out to folks is that this looks like a pretty simple map in identifying these opportunity areas, but we have to keep in mind all of the data that's driving these few different layers that we've used for intersection, right? So our CCVI, our Climate Change Vulnerability Index, has a few different dozen data types driving that vulnerability and identifying these hotspots of vulnerability for heat and flood. Our TOD areas and our planned future development areas, those are all based on a lot of planning and good work coming out of the POCDs and other TOD plans and things like that. And then our zones of shared risk, those have been delineated, again, pulling info from hazard mitigation plans, modifying those based on stakeholder feedback, and just incorporating some local knowledge into some of these zones, right? So there's a lot of different data driving these, this kind of intersection overlay process. So we took all of these overlays and kind of put a human touch to it, right? We can use GIS for a lot of great things, but sometimes you just need to kind of sort through the data. So at first glance, we were realizing that a lot of these areas are intersecting perfectly, right? We can see all of these different factors and all of these different resources laid on top of each other. But then there's a few other areas where I like to say, we're not hitting that sweet spot, or maybe the puzzle pieces aren't fitting quite perfectly together. So we've developed this idea of these tier 1 and tier 2 opportunity areas. So these areas aren't necessarily based on priority. It doesn't mean that tier 1 or tier 2 will definitely be getting a project, one won't. It doesn't have anything to do with that. It really just has to do with characterizing these opportunity areas so we know how well some of these pieces are fitting together. So here we have a tier 1 opportunity area. So you can see this is in Derby. You can see it right at along the Housatonic there. You can see that we have some TOD, we have some high flood, high heat, we have the regional zone of shared risk, and there's a few critical facilities and even a shelter in that circle opportunity area. And so you can see all of those are pretty overlaid well, right? They're all fitting together. That regional zone of shared risk is pretty encompassed by that high flood, high heat vulnerability. So we know that throughout that zone of shared risk, there's a relatively, consistent vulnerability, right? There's likely not much variation according to the CCVI. And then you can see it's, there's a lot of the TOD area in there as well. So then taking a look at a tier 2, similar process, right? We looked at all of that overlay, but again, we're not quite fitting all of those pieces right. So if you look at this opportunity area in Seymour, which is more of an oval shape, You can see we have our regional zone in the purple. We have a few specks here and there of the high flood, high heat. We do have some of the TOD that crosses into the regional zone, right? So you can see that it's not all fitting together, but we still want to take a closer look, right? Just because one cell is high flood, high heat, that doesn't mean that the neighboring cell isn't experiencing some of that same vulnerability, right? So we don't want to discount it. It's just telling us to take a little bit of a closer look in this opportunity area to really sort through some of the vulnerabilities, right? So just a way to characterize kind of what we're looking at. So what does that give us? That gives us some opportunity areas up and down here throughout the NVCOG region. So you can see we have a few tier 1s and a few tier 2s. And we'll go through these a little bit more in depth in just a minute, but just to show you kind of a region level scope graphic here. So there's 6, I believe. I don't think we have any closer. The numbers are starting to jumble between COGs here, but 6 in the NVCOG region. And I believe it's 4 tier 1s and 2 tier 2s. So what's the next step, right? So we've got these opportunity areas. We've done this overlay, but just to try to tie it all together, what's our end game here, right? This is all well and great. We've collected a ton of data and we've put a lot of time and energy into identifying these vulnerabilities and these opportunity areas. So let's try to piece this together. So some things that we want to keep in mind as we're having our discussion. So we've put together several kind of fact sheets or flyers, if you will, to present all of these opportunity areas with some of the characteristics that are pertinent if you're just flipping through trying to understand what's going on. So just keep in mind, right, this is all overlay based on the flood, heat, and social vulnerability and zones of shared risk and assets and infrastructure, right? So this is, GIS process, but also a little bit of a human hand as well. And again, we're depicting all of these on individual pages. So a little computer, little human here. And then some other things that you'll see on these sheets. And this is, if you've taken a look at these on the Resilient Connecticut website, on the workshop page, you'll know what I'm referring to. If not, we'll show them in just a second. But taking a look at some of the scores here. So if you were taking a look at the CCVI, we do have a lot of rankings on 1 to 5, but then that final vulnerability score is on a 0 to 1. But just keep in mind, usually those higher numbers, so whether it's a 4 or a 5, or if it's closer to 1, so 0.9, it's just insinuating a little bit of a higher vulnerability, whether it's heat, flood, or social. And these are all relative to the region. For zones with shared risk, to help a little bit with planning efforts, so whether you're looking at the graphics on the next few slides or you're taking a look at the viewer, all of these zones of shared risk have an individual identification number, and they all begin with a number to identify which watershed those are in. So for example, 6900, if you were to see that and the beginning ID of the zones of shared risk, that would indicate the Naugatuck River watershed. And then the areas of plan development. So we've gathered a lot of these from all different types of community plans. So a lot of these have been delineated on our end and geo-referenced into GIS. So everything is a kind of a work in progress when we say, naming some of these areas, these opportunity areas and things like that. So just some notes to keep in mind when taking a look at the sheets. And then also, as we're going into the breakout groups, here's a few questions that I want you to keep in mind as well, right? This is what we're here today to try to get out of this. So are there other assets in a particular area that may have been overlooked, right? We have a large geodatabase here of all the different types of assets and infrastructure that we've been looking at to identify these regional zones of shared risk, but we want to make sure if there's something important to your municipality or to the region, that we're capturing that, right? We want to make sure we're covering all our bases here. And then in addition, are there any resources or assets maybe located outside of an opportunity area? So if you're taking a look at an area and you say, well, a lot of the residents rely on this location or whatever it may be, but it's not in an opportunity area, we want to know. We want to try to identify these links between vulnerable areas and maybe resilient locations or, other assets and infrastructure that are critical to, alleviating some of these vulnerabilities. And then when we're looking at these opportunity areas, are there any specific flood or heat risk locations that come to mind? To try to pinpoint some of the issues in some of these opportunity areas, will help us characterize these areas a little bit better. And then for those that eventually go on to design, can be incorporated into the design. And then are there any other planning efforts occurring in either a specific opportunity area or in your municipality? And these can be directly or indirectly related to resilience, right? This is just a good way for us to figure out where we can link some of the Resilient Connecticut efforts with other efforts that are occurring, kind of on the ground already or in the works in your municipality or in the region. So with that being said, I believe we're going to.
So Victoria, do you want me to take back over? So, because I know as we get closer to the breakouts, you need to do some administrative things. So I can give you a break if you want.
That would be good. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to take us through an example that is outside the region, and you'll all see why we're doing this before we go into the opportunity area info sheets for the NVCOG region. And this is in Bridgeport, so not too far away, just down Route 8. This is an area that has a zone of shared risk, which we are showing you the shape of it in the upper left graphic. And on the right-hand side, we have the flood and heat vulnerability scores in their grid cells. And then on the lower left, we have the combined flood and heat vulnerability scores. So I'm showing you this outside the region so you can get oriented, and then we're going to look at these inside the region. Okay, so what are we looking at exactly? If you look at the flood vulnerability scores on the right-hand side, the darker blues represent the higher flood vulnerabilities. And remember, that's got three components: sensitivity, exposure, and then adaptive capacity. So not a big surprise probably to learn that there's some flood risk in the south end of Bridgeport. You've probably heard that in the past. You probably haven't thought as much about the heat risk down there. So the heat vulnerabilities, which are again have the same three components: sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity. Those are shown in the lower right. And so the darker oranges kind of have that higher heat vulnerability score. In general, pretty high flood and pretty high heat vulnerabilities in this area. If you combine them, look in the lower left, that box in the middle is kind of the matrix. The lower axis is flood in the left-hand side. So the x-axis is flood, the y-axis is heat. I'm sorry to get all algebraic on you for a moment. And so you can look and see that a lot of the squares are in the higher flood vulnerability part of the graphic. And that's represented in the darker red and purple colors in the graphic in the lower left. So that's kind of the way that we're looking at these zones of shared risk. And then moving one forward, this is kind of that same information depicted in more of a map format. So this is what we're calling an information sheet for a potential opportunity area. So you can see in the table on the left-hand side, the flood, heat, and social vulnerability scores, all of them really relatively high for this part of Bridgeport. The zone of shared risk with that drainage basin number, 7,000, which is the shoreline. And then we have a couple other pieces of information. So what regional infrastructure is present? And we don't attempt to list all of them. So we've just got a couple examples in this box, just to keep it pretty concise. We're saying whether or not there's an area of planned development present, and which is not applicable in this one case. Is there a federal opportunity zone present? In this case, there is. And then is there transit-oriented development nearby? In this case, it is nearby. So that, remember that gray crosshatch, that's the TOD 0.75 mile drive shed and walk shed on the upper part of the graphic on the right. And one reason why we chose this example as an example for you, even though it's outside the NVCOG region, is because there is federal attention, of course, and state attention in this area by virtue of the Rebuild by Design and Resilient Bridgeport projects, which are being designed as we speak by others. And so it's a good example because if it was something that had happened 5 years in the future, it could have happened as advised by the analysis that was undertaken for Resilient Connecticut Phase 2. It just so happens that this was done ahead of time, but it kind of is a good model for where we're going. And so if you put together this zone of shared risk analysis and this information here in this table, you can kind of envision how that information could have been brought forward to come up with the conceptual design that is being developed for Resilient Bridgeport. This is a graphic on the left-hand side of the potential flood protection system that's being designed. And then the graphic on the right-hand side is a photo rendering of what that might look like. So the flood protection is going to be elevated roads that are landscaped, a lot of pedestrian access, a lot of trees for greening and for providing shade, which can help get at the heat vulnerabilities. And so when you think about these areas, think about ultimately what kind of project could address the flood and heat vulnerabilities that are present, and what sort of benefits could be provided to vulnerable populations. So again, an example from outside the region, just to kind of get your mind thinking about what we could do inside the NVCOG region. So now we'll kind of step through them. And then when we're done with this, we'll go into the breakout sessions. And again, this approach is a little bit different than we used the last 3 days, where we saved the next few slides for the breakout sessions. But there's a smaller number today, and we have a lot of state agencies present. So again, we're trying something different on this last day of the workshop series. So going from north to south, we're going to start in Waterbury. This is the Waterville part of Waterbury, where there is a zone of shared risk, where one of the water courses, I think it's Hancock Brook, joins the Naugatuck River. The area is partly in a FEMA floodplain. There is some flood protection system components. Some components are in place here. We understand this is downstream of the Thomaston Dam, and so there's a lot of flood control on the Naugatuck River, but there is still flood risk that's present. And over time, as climate changes, we understand that the risks can change. If you look at the right-hand side, the cells with a higher flood risk have the darker blue, and on the lower right-hand side, the cells with a higher heat vulnerability have the darker oranges. You put them all together, looking on the left-hand side, lower left, and you have kind of a diverse profile in the zone of shared risk. So some of the parts of the zone of shared risk have high heat and high flood vulnerability, but some have kind of a lower profile of heat and flood vulnerability. Well, why might that be? Well, there are some areas in the zone of shared risk that are a little bit further from the water courses, or that already have some green spaces to provide some shade, maybe some cooling. And so it's not an area that has extremely high flood and heat throughout, like the example in Bridgeport that I just showed you, but it does have some areas of high heat and high flood vulnerability. So what could that look like? Is it an opportunity area? Well, remember all the things that Victoria said were necessary. We need to overlap with regional assets, and we need to understand what those are. So for example, in this region, it's Route 8, there's public water and sewer, there's a museum that comes up in one of the geodatabases. So there's a lot of things in this area that are considered of regional significance, importance to the region. It does not have an area plan development present. It is not a federal opportunity zone, and it doesn't have that TOD nexus or connection. And we'll see that coming up in the next few graphics. So this is considered a tier 2, again, not less important than a tier 1, but it doesn't have as many of those things linking to it as a tier 1 area might have. So just stepping through a couple more, now that I've kind of over-explained the colors and the grid cells, we could go a little bit faster. So this is the Freight Street part of Waterbury, and it's a pretty large zone of shared risk. It represents a whole west side of downtown along the Naugatuck River. It's a variation in flood and heat vulnerabilities in this area. Elsewhere in Waterbury, moving a little bit further to the east in the downtown area, this is an area that has some flood vulnerability. It's not a FEMA mapped flood zone, but there are 2 water courses that come together. They are in culverts, and there are drainage related problems, and sometimes some surcharging that occurs when the capacities are exceeded of these culverts underground that carry the streams. So it is an area that Waterbury has been looking at to try to reduce the flood risk. And there is very high heat vulnerability in this area because of the developed nature. So if you look at that graphic in the lower middle section of the page, you'll see now all the cells are kind of squished to the top of that matrix. So if you look at the x-axis, which is flood, and the y-axis, which is heat, all the different cells in that zone of shared risk that have low or high flood vulnerability, they all have pretty high heat vulnerability. One more zone of shared risk in Waterbury that we looked at was down where the Mad River, confluence with the Naugatuck River occurs, so south of downtown. And if you put these zones of shared risk together and overlay them with the TOD area, you see that it overlaps with all of them. So that gray crosshatch, which is the TOD 0.75 drive shed and walk shed around the rail station, it touches all of these zones of shared risk. There's also quite a lot of regional infrastructure present. There are historic resources, historic district. There's 2 federal opportunity zones. And so this is an area that we expect could have some attention. We're calling it an opportunity area because there may be some way to sort of address the heat and flood risks all at the same time with some kind of comprehensive, complex, innovative projects that could be undertaken. And we'll talk about where that could occur as we go through the slides today. Moving further south, so this is downtown Naugatuck, an area that is adjacent to the Naugatuck River, but also upstream along, I think, Long Meadow Pond Brook. Could be mistaken. I'll double check that later. So it's kind of the confluence of two streams. So there's some flood risk, some high heat vulnerabilities due to the developed nature of the area. There's also historic district. There's a TOD area. You can see the gray crosshatch for the TOD area in Naugatuck around the train station. So we're calling this an opportunity area. This is a tier 1 because the train station TOD area overlaps with the zone of shared risk and those regional assets. Moving a little further south, here's one that's going to be a little bit of an oddball. So this is a zone of shared risk where Beacon Falls and Ansonia meet. Sorry, Beacon Falls and Seymour meet. That's a typo in the upper left. We know that Seymour is to the south of Beacon Falls. There's some flood vulnerability along the Naugatuck River. The heat vulnerabilities kind of are a little bit more relaxed. There's a lot of green space, even though there are some developed areas. And if you take this and overlay it with the Seymour TOD, it does have a very slight overlay, but only for a small area. So we're calling this one a tier 2, simply because the zone of shared risk is not immediately over the TOD area. There are some pieces of regional infrastructure present, such as Metro North, public water and sewer, et cetera. Area of planned development is located here as well, identified by the town of Seymour. And now we're moving into Ansonia Derby area. There's a large zone of shared risk along the Naugatuck River. We do understand that there's flood control protection along the river. Many of you have probably seen the greenways, which are along the top of the earthen embankments. So there is a reduction in risk, but risk is still present along rivers. A lot of flood vulnerabilities have been mapped. If you look at the darker blues on the right-hand side, and then the heat vulnerabilities, which are not unexpected. There's a lot of developed land. Here's kind of a smaller zone of shared risk. What we've done is we have some nested zones of shared risk where there's kind of some more specific kinds of flood risk. So this is one that's been drawn on the west bank of the right bank of the Naugatuck River. And then here's one on the opposite side, the area that's historically had a lot of industrial development. And if you overlay these small nested zones of shared risk with the larger one along the river, and then you also look at the, there's a lot of regional infrastructure present, Metro North, Route 8, electric substations, wastewater treatment plants, et cetera. And then you also look at the TOD area and the areas of planned development, very high opportunity present here to kind of have a project that can have many benefits at once to reducing heat and flood vulnerabilities. And a lot of that actually could be coupled with redevelopment. So very promising kind of situation, fits well with the goals of Resilient Connecticut. Then moving a little further downstream, just another zone of shared risk. This one is more in Derby. And then a smaller one right in the downtown area, kind of near O'Sullivan's Island, and areas that are being targeted for some type of redevelopment that's appropriate when there's flood risk. And then a little bit further upstream along the Housatonic River. So if you put those areas together and look at the TOD area, which is the gray crosshatch, a lot of regional infrastructure. So there's electric substations, law enforcement, the bus facility, a regional transit center, for example, is all right here. So this is another opportunity area. And this one actually would benefit Shelton as well. So Shelton could be a contributor to anything going on in this area going forward to reduce the heat and flood vulnerabilities. So I think what we're going to do now, Victoria, what was our final count on attendees for today? Who's here?
Yeah, so we have about 12 from between the state and then through the region. So I think we're going to do some short breakouts like we planned, and then we'll see how the conversation goes, and then we'll come back to, we'll reconvene as a big group.
Okay. And why don't we give people 5 minutes to kind of take a quick break? So we'll start the breakouts at 1:50.
Okay.
But you can switch over to the rooms now.
Sure. Okay. Looks like we have everybody back.
All right. I can do the report out for one of the rooms, and then Victoria, is it you or Scott or Johanna doing the other report?
I guess Scott and I'll figure it out.
I'll go first to give you guys a chance to hash that out. Okay, so I had the room that was meant to be mostly towns, but we had a mixture of towns and some folks from Circa. The towns that were present were Beacon Falls and Ansonia and Derby through various representatives. One of them being a resident, which was great actually. It's nice to have residents involved in these meetings. We also had some folks from NVCOG, and so we bounced around on a lot of topics. Actually, one of the most interesting variations in topics of all these workshops this week. We talked a lot about TOD and what it means to these valley towns, to a Waterbury, to a Beacon Falls, to a Derby and Sonia, and how do we make these cities walkable and develop the TOD areas, but also attract people to use them? Some of the things that we talked about were, is it easier in Connecticut to drive to Milford to get on the train than to get on the train in Ansonia or Derby? How do we bring people back to the TOD areas that we're talking about in these towns, rather than having them move to the small towns as a stepping stone and eventually move back out and seek transit in other ways? And then we kind of linked all that to resilience. So how do we find some co-benefits to deal with the flood risks and the heat risks while addressing those kind of logistical problems that people have at the same time? So I'm keeping this very high level because we really dived into the details. So it's a good discussion. We talked a lot about other benefits of resilience planning and climate change planning, sort of reducing the number of cars on the road. We want to make sure we can address CO2 emissions and mitigation while we can at the same time, increasing densities. We talked a lot about what it means to redevelop brownfields and urbanized areas. There are a lot of ways to return on the investment sort of monetarily when we redevelop brownfields into housing or mixed uses, but we don't have as good a way to capture that return on investment when we're looking at turning them into green spaces, which could help address the heat. So we want to make sure that we take care of that. Be aware of the flood risk as we redevelop brownfields. We also talked about, Freight Street area in Waterbury, the vision for that and how they could be in other areas in Waterbury being redeveloped, how they could be kind of used to find sort of new job centers. My abysmal report out is not reflective of the quality of the discussion. I think we just covered so much that I'm having trouble sort of digesting it into one concise, pithy statement. Anybody in my group want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I was just me being on the inland wetlands, the heat, the heat index or whatever isn't really any part of my being on the commission. Would that be more planning and zoning versus inland wetlands? I can see the floodwaters, but not, I don't know how you would incorporate that in if a new project wanted to come in. Maybe I'm missing something.
No, it's a good point. I think we need to do better sort of communicating that.
And I just wanted to add that I still think storm vulnerability as a climate change vulnerability is important and worth looking at.
Agreed. Thank you. All right, other team?
I can start. Ours was less in depth and had a couple of focus areas, so I'll go through them in general. But we had representatives from DOT, DEEP, USACE, the Corps of Engineers, and Circa on the line, and we talked a lot, as you can imagine, with those organizations on the line about communication amongst all the different entities and agencies doing sort of resilience oftentimes in a silo, the need to coordinate with GC3 and specifically conservation districts and land trusts, neighborhood community groups, and others to help with our prioritization process and how we'd be doing that more as we move into phase 3 or phase 4 of the project. We had a brief discussion about population growth, whether that was factored in, and what changes are currently happening with population growth as a result of, or population movement, I should say, as a result of COVID, which is interesting. Will be interesting to look at probably a few years from now. Traffic density was suggested as something that we may want to consider, in addition to just movement of people, with the density of traffic, and there's data available for that. We had a short discussion about solar energy security versus preservation of land and environmental preservation in general. So solar for redundancy and energy security. And then we ended with a discussion about the need to coordinate with the new Office of Resilience and Sustainability at DOT, and how projects that they may be looking at in the near future will be have overlap with some of the projects that we'll ultimately select. Victoria or John or Joanna have anything to add?
Just worth mentioning that real quick, it was worth mentioning all the different entities, and who are we talking to, and what considerations are we taking, right? Are we incorporating land trusts? Are we talking with land trusts? A little bit about community engagement. Are we going to get community groups and neighborhood groups involved? Reaching out to conservation districts. So a lot of good questions raised on who we're talking to and what we're taking into consideration here. So it's good to get outside thoughts on who and where to chat and get involved. Go ahead, Joanna.
And maintaining a focus on environmental justice communities and making sure they're not only involved in the planning, but also recipients of the projects and the efforts.
Right.
Yes.
That was a comment in the chat. That's it.
Okay. Well, why don't we still have time for open discussion, but let me just go through the next steps briefly. So we've got a draft report to describe the CCVI for flood and heat zones of shared risk and these potential adaptation resilience opportunity areas coming out in about 3-4 weeks. I'm pleased to say now that we've made it through the 4th and final workshop this week that I don't think we have a lot of huge revisions to make, but we do have to go back and reconsider some things that we've heard over the course of this week. So we'll take a few days to digest that and kind of go back and refine a couple of things. But in general, what we've been showing you, I think, is kind of what will go forward to the report. As we transition from phase 2 into phase 3, what does that mean? So CERCA's team will be working with the COGs, the towns, state agency partners to advance the planning and start to identify areas for potential pilot projects where there's the most value. So what do we mean by value, right? We mean where there's been planning gaps. So for example, I've used Bridgeport as an example already. There's been a lot of intense planning in Bridgeport and in New Haven, but some towns haven't received this level of planning. And so that's a gap, right? Where can CERCA kind of step in and help fill that? Where there's alignment with COG and city and town priorities, and where local state leverage is possible. These are all important considerations in taking these opportunity areas and moving them ahead as pilot projects. And then CERCA will be helping to identify other funding opportunities going forward. And there were a couple of comments in my breakout room about funding in the future, so it's good to hear that there's eyes on that as well. We talked about, we've been hinting at and looking at examples of adaptation and resilience projects. We looked at Resilient Bridgeport earlier in the workshop. I wanted to just show you a couple other examples. So many of us are driven through Meriden. It's not too far out of the NVCOG region. And as you may know, there's a new park next to the Meriden Railroad Station. So this is right smack in the middle of the TOD area. It's where transit-oriented development is desired. Old commercial buildings were torn down, and Harbor Brook was daylighted, taken out of its culvert. And now when it floods, it doesn't damage properties, it damages less fewer properties because it's in a new floodplain in this park. We have green space, which can help address heat. So think about this kind of project in the context of what are the flood-related benefits, what are the heat-related benefits, what are the benefits to vulnerable populations. Well, you can see right on the graphic, there's public housing in close proximity, so now there's a place to go, an area to use, common space. And then is there a connection to resilient corridors? Well, it's right next to the railroad station. And there's been a lot of investment on CT rail. This is that line from Hartford to New Haven. So start to think about how that all can come together to make this area kind of a desirable place to live, work, and also not be at risk to flooding and extreme heat. And we looked at this example earlier, so I won't say too much more about it, but think about Resilient Bridgeport. What are the benefits to the heat vulnerabilities and the flood risks that are present in this area? And what are the benefits to vulnerable populations? Well, there'll be a resilience community center, right? So that's an area that people can use once it's completed. So sometimes the benefits are not where a person lives exactly, but they're maybe not too far away, some new resource they can use. This is another project in Bridgeport. This is right slightly to the west of the one we just looked at. This is the Rebuild by Design focus area. So there are a few things going on here. There's some stormwater and sanitary sewer system separation to improve water quality. There's some green infrastructure that will help address some of the stormwater related flooding, retrofits to housing, that sort of thing. And so what are the benefits to flood risk, to heat, and then to vulnerable populations? You know, I think those are all boxes that could be checked by this project. And we've talked about Freight Street in previous meetings with the COG, and we talked about Freight Street, I think, in the workshops in January when we were talking about potential examples for opportunity areas. It's good to say that we eventually identified this as an opportunity area since we showed our hand several months ago. It would have been embarrassing if this one didn't make it to the end. This is an area that has some heat vulnerabilities, some flood vulnerabilities, is a TOD area. There are plans to redevelop this part of Waterbury. So the left-hand graphic is kind of an existing conditions assessment, different buildings. And then the middle, or the right-hand side, sorry, is what that could look like. It's one of the many concept plans that's been developed. It's not the only concept plan, it's one of the concept plans. And then the lower graphic is kind of a photo rendering of what this area could look like. So not a huge parking lot. There is some parking. There's some green space as you head down towards the Naugatuck River. But this is also near the railroad station, which is right off the image to the right-hand side. You can see Route 8 in the background. So start to think about how some of these areas that have been identified by the communities can be sort of can be merged with these resilience opportunity areas to become projects. So what else could you put in the Freight Street area that would make it a resilience project? Well, we might have a microgrid for power redundancy. We might have a new shelter to be used during storms. We might have some resilient housing that's built. We might have a building that's flood-proof as it's redeveloped. We could have green roofs. Lots of things that can be combined to have multiple benefits in an area. So I've kind of yammered on long enough. I will show you some resources that are available, and we can go ahead and make sure these are available to all the people who registered. Victoria, I think the email that you sent out has the links as well. So go to the Resilient Connecticut website. You can look at the climate fact sheets for heat and for flooding. You can kind of play around with the CCVI, the viewer tool that we've developed to look at the heat and the flood vulnerabilities. And you can look at the story map as well. My breakout group, we actually were in the story map for a little while. So now you're familiar with it. And with that, I think we're just going to open up to open discussion. I haven't watched the chat. Anything in there, Victoria? No, I don't think so.
I did just throw the links in there. But I did want to say that also, you know, take a few minutes now that now that we've introduced the opportunity areas, I've been telling all the workshops, you know, take a few minutes, take a look at the viewer and dig around with some of the resources, and that pre-workshop survey, the Survey Monkey one that I sent out is still open, and I'll leave that open for a while. So that's one good place to provide any opportunity area related feedback. And then there's a few other resources on the Resilient Connecticut website as well, including the Resilient Connecticut story map, and then the website itself. And then there's also all of our contacts as well. So any other feedback or thoughts on anything, especially, coming out of some of these, consideration conversations and things we've had, there's a few opportunities. So, so feel free to reach out if you've got anything after the fact. Anyone else? Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
Well, I have one question that I'd like people to, answer if they can. And that is, are there any sort of big projects that you're aware of in the towns that you live that are popular and likely to get moved forward in the next 5 to 10 years, but that we don't know about? So no, good. That's great.
All right.
I know there are redevelopment plans in downtown Derby, in downtown Ansonia, in some of those industrial legacy areas, and pretty much in all of our downtowns, Naugatuck, Waterbury.
So are those in the plans of conservation and development or hazard mitigation plans?
Some of them probably are. I think we could certainly help reach out more directly to the municipalities and get you guys whatever plans exist.
Yeah, because that's like I guess what we're trying to figure out how to make extra value, get extra value, is do things that towns want, whilst also reducing flood risk, right? And I think what happens is in many places in the past is people have focused on, we're going to make the train station less vulnerable to flooding, or the water treatment plant less vulnerable to flooding, and then the money comes up and the project gets done. Where, well, with this opportunity, we're looking for multiple benefits, and so when we know, it's easy to identify what's risky, there's so many things that are at risk from flooding, right? That it's easy to find some of those projects. Finding ones that are going to have extra value or are extra in some other way is what we're after, and that's why knowing what towns would like to do in these general areas is so valuable.
Jim, I think we have some of that mapped out. So I can show you kind of what we found, and you can compare it to what Aaron sends us.
Yeah, I appreciate that, David. I just want to understand, like the New Haven Airport thing, right? That didn't show up like on our radar until the last minute, and then all of a sudden, right, it had been there's advocates for it in that particular neighborhood, and I'm sure there's things like that in other parts of the state too. And the more we know, the more opportunities we have to be complementary to what they want to do.
Yeah, definitely.
But we probably got the best inventory that there is now, right? And we have to go. We've got a schedule, so we have to go forward.
The Naugatuck River Greenway that was mentioned is interesting. It's interesting to think about those kinds of large regional scale or somewhat regional scale greenway networks projects, and how that might relate to the resilience planning that we're thinking about here. Well, I wonder whether whether there's like infrastructure investment going into that kind of a river greenway project, or whether it's more about trail systems. Aaron, you had mentioned that.
Yeah, I mean they're much bigger than just trails, I mean they're $2-3 million a mile. They really are. They're like a roadway project, really. I mean, just for bikes and pedestrians. And I can. We just finished a priorities prioritization for projects along the Greenway, and I'll drop that into the chat right now. It's got there's a link in it that has a map that sort of shows the planned route and the sections that have already been built.
Yeah, that's terrific. That's the kind of thing that I was like hinting at. You know, there's so many things going on that, and it's not even clear who to ask and what the question should be. So we're just laying out the general theme and looking for input.
I have one question. Is this resiliency project in conjunction with what the state legislators are considering of taking over local planning and zoning? And whether it is or not, or will my position go away from inland wetlands? Because I mean, I still think that local control, people who have lived in the town for many years, knows the area specifically, versus having everything done out of Hartford. Is this in conjunction with what they're proposing?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, there's definitely there are multiple motivations for everything, obviously, right? But the zoning thing, it wasn't about taking over all zoning, but it was sort of requiring towns to be more effective at getting low-income housing within their cities, right? Some cities have got no affordable housing, right? So that's what it was really about. This project is totally different.
Okay.
We're interested in, you know, reducing flood risk and improving other things, and so housing and floodplains, etc., are all kind of linked in ours. But there's, I thought you were going to go to the bill that's pending on flood and erosion control board assessments and what's it called, the home sale fees. It's like a I forget what it's called. Basically, essentially a tax.
The buyer's
a conveyance fee.
A conveyance fee. It's not a tax. That's right. There's some controversy about that too, and these things are all part of climate change adaptation. You know, things cost money to do. Towns need to do stuff. They're going to need money, and federal, and even with the project that we're planning, if we got $60 million from the federal government, the towns and the states got to put up something like 50-30. So towns are going to be needing to pay for stuff.
Towns also, just to assure you, Frederick, this doesn't. I'm going to assume, right? These projects still need approval from local zoning and all the requisite approvals. So it's not like this would blow over everything. And the other thing is, there's been the legislation you mentioned. There has been a lot of fear mongering about that. I would highly advise you go read the law yourself, because it's there's a lot of like talking points and like one-liners about how the control goes to Hartford and it takes away local zoning, but it's much more complex than that, and better designed than that.
And where can I find that? Because obviously the local newspapers aren't delving into it.
I'll put a link. Yeah. I'll put a link in the chat. If we're talking about the same thing, I'll put a link in the chat, and hopefully that's what you were getting at before.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think those are important. Those are important steps. You know, these changes are difficult, and good information is critical.
Yeah, and I would just say that a lot of the intention with Circa is really to connect with the local experience and build on that knowledge base to inform flood resiliency practices, and to bring technical expertise that's informed that's informed through the process of generating that technical analysis to bear on decision making and flood management. So I think the larger intention with Circa is to really work with local decision makers.
Yeah, we're from the state, and we're here to help. Right, that one. So that's why that's why we have David do it. Nobody believes it when the state people say that they're going to help. Some reason they think the contractors are going to do it. Anyway,
I think the feds say that, not the state, but yeah.
Great work, David.
Well, I think on that note, so we have 2 more minutes before 3 o'clock. Any final comments or thoughts from anybody?
Hi, everyone. Yes, this is Marissa. It was a great session today. I really enjoyed being here. It sounds like with all the planning going forward, that partners are going to be critical. So I think, I'm not sure if a list of partners has been ironed out yet, but involving those folks from the beginning, I think would be critical and very useful in this process. And some of those partners may be able to help fund these projects down the road, you know, whether they're local nonprofits or businesses, things like that. So I just wanted to add that in, and it's been great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good to see everybody, for sure.
All right, great.
Thanks, everyone.
Alex.
Thank you.